So I'm Tricia, and Neville, for those of you with facial eczema work, already will know him. But
so I'm based in Ruakura in Hamilton, and I look after the Ramguard program, which has been going for over 30 years, but I took over about 4 to 5 years ago, in communicating with the farmers and working out dose rates and getting information loaded into SIL.
so this is an interactive workshop, so can everybody please stand up? So a map of New Zealand. Black area is areas, this was done in 2009, that were identified as being potential facial eczema hotspots. So if you currently ram breed within the black area or sell rams into the black area, stay standing. But if you are white through breeding and white through selling rams, sit down. Oh, we've got most of them still standing, Neville, this time. But what would happen if we put up this slide? This is, we don't like to talk about climate change, and somebody in the last presentation pointed out, well, we're already on our way here. So if you are sitting down but you sell rams into the new black area or are breeding in the new black area, please stand back up again. So with the exception of George right in the front row, I think we are pretty...
We just miss it. I want to sit down.
And so for this audience, facial eczema is currently a real issue, or moving into the future, it is going to become a real issue for either yourselves as breeders or for your commercial clients. You can also... You can...
Down for the camera.
You're assuming on global warming.
What was the last report? Freezing.
So we're talking a little bit to the preaching to converted with this particular audience, but Neville will still work through a slide here.
So this is what the sporodesmin looks like when you look at it under a microscope. They look like little grenades, and really that is what is happening. They are sort of exploding in the pasture, and they do damage to the sheep as they are ingested. So there are different types of sporodesmin, but in New Zealand we seem to have the dangerous type of it. Some of the Northern Hemisphere will have sporodesmin also, or the fungi, but it's not the toxic type, but we don't seem to be.
Richard?
Anybody know what the situation is in Australia, like for Victoria and the green belts?
Yeah, well, yes, Victoria certainly gets it. There's been reports put out, and the dairy industry is infected in Australia, in the Victoria area. So that southeastern area of Australia does get facial eczema.
So most of you in the audience at this moment in time will know what facial eczema looks like, but for those that are not familiar with what it actually looks like, an example of an animal that has actually had clinical exposure and clinical signs, and this is in recovery, and as gruesome as it is, I've actually requested that somebody in the audience will provide a non-1970s picture to put in the middle for future presentations, but the impact is really mediated through liver damage. And so one of the issues that we have is that facial eczema, as Neville pointed out in an earlier lot, was that if you actually see an animal like this, the amount of subclinical condition that you actually have is going to be massive. If you actually get to the point of having clinical animals, you're going to have major subclinical impacts, and the impacts can range through reproduction, through growth. Any number of potential things that you have are going to be impacted through facial eczema.
And this liver damage, the liver is a very slow regenerating organ, so that damage never really disappears. And I've had clients say they've cut up an animal a year later and they can see that it's had facial eczema, and it's probably a year old, but it never really goes. It is slowly repairing, but very slow. This is what you see in the Waikato Times. Has been printing reports like this for years and years, courtesy of some of the local labs in Hamilton. They've been putting this in the newspaper, and that was a bad 2011 when everything was in the dangerous red level, and that was yeah. So it's an indicator for this Waikato anyway, to how bad that FE can be.
But this is an example in the middle of a Gribbles output from last year. It covers Northland, Auckland, Bay of Plenty, Waikato, Taranaki, East Coast, Lower North Island, and they've already started reporting for the South Island, albeit Tasman at the top. It is actually something that is now pretty much a North Island issue, all bar very small areas, and creeping into the South Island.
And the last one is just an annual thing. You can see the black one was the 2011 one, which was that year over there. So that's just the variation you get in a year. Sometimes it's a bit later, sometimes a bit earlier. Depends when those rains come. This is what I presented at a conference last year in this building on Ramguard, which had reached 30 years of being in existence. So I presented a paper, and this was some of the genetics that the Auckland Romney Development Group gave me to present. And so the bottom line is their breeding value, how it's increased for the group over that length of time. And the top line is the dose rate that has slowly been increased. So 1984 they started at 0.10 milligrams of sporidesmin per kilogram of live weight, and they slowly increased it as their natural tolerance levels increased in their stock. We had to increase the dose rates to keep challenging the animals. And they peaked their dose rate at about 0.65. Here's about 30 years here, so after about 30 years they're 0.65, but the breeding values are still going up. So it just shows that you know, they're still making selection criteria within their sheep flock now.
Will those flatten off?
Sorry? Breeding values? Yeah. Well, I would have thought so, but it hasn't. I was quite surprised it's still going up like that. They're still getting animals that react in their dosing. They're still dosing. They're still getting animals that react in their dosing. So that's why we still encourage people to keep on doing it.
And so one of the key things about facial eczema is that it is a very heritable trait. Pretty much of any of the traits that we deal with in our research, it's at about 0.4, so it is a very highly heritable trait. And you can see the genetic progress that has been able to be achieved as a result of having that level of genetic variation in our industry. So because it is a trait that is very hard to measure, and it costs over $200 to $300 to actually get a ram to go through the sporidesmin Ramguard program, and it can result in loss of life in animals that are very susceptible to it. It is one of these traits that is considered very hard to measure, and so it really ideally suits itself to this whole concept of genomics, which is what beef and lamb genetics is partially about.
The biggest cost really over and above the actual drenching for it is the ones that don't pass, because you're only testing your top animals, and if they don't pass the sporidesmin test, that's a huge cost.
Yep.
So if anyone's starting to think about it.
And so where we have been working with the area of genomics for facial eczema within Ovita and now the Beef and Lamb Genetics program is that any animal that has gone through the Ramguard testing program, or the majority of them, Neville will always ask or send out the samples that we actually collect a DNA or a tissue sample to get DNA. We have gone through and we have genotyped using either the 5K or the 50K genotyping platform just under 1,000 Coopworths, only about 362 Perrindales, and to date just over 2,000 Romneys. We've got a whole lot more samples sitting over here that we can have access to, but one of the issues is that for anybody that's part of the greater program supplying rams to, historically it was Nadia or Lucy or currently Anna, is that those rams that are part of the industry sires program, they standardly get genotyped using the 50K or now the HD genotype. But these animals, a lot of them never actually go on to become sires, and so we don't actually end up getting them genotyped as part of that program. So they have to be genotyped independently of the greater program, and it's pretty much the only trait where we have this real issue, that so few, less than 10% of these animals are actually genotyped because they're sires. And so that's an issue that we have, but so far we have a nice genomic prediction accuracy of 0.47 for the Romneys. Coopworth is not reportable at 0.233, and Perrindales is sitting quite high at 0.519, but it's based on so few flocks that we don't have any confidence in actually reporting them out to the industry at this stage. So that is where we have been sitting with the genomics. This is an example of what, this is an example of what genomics can actually achieve and do, is that this is the EBV accuracy. If you have got animals that have never been tested, you've got a 0 accuracy based on the EBVs because they don't have any information. If they go ahead and are tested using the genomic test, so the 5K prediction test, you can lift the accuracies up to between that 30 and 40% using the genomic test, but there's a big caveat that I'll come to in a couple of minutes. But one of the things that we are very conscious and aware of with this is that we are not saying that you can go in and just use the genomic test to actually solve all your facial eczema problems. What we are saying is that you may be able to leapfrog and not have to start back here where most of the industry did back in 1984, dosing at a very, very, very low level, but that you'll be able to move yourself and kind of move up that ladder and be able to start testing at a slightly higher dose if we have that information coming through. But one of the key things about genomic prediction, and Dan presented it very well this morning, is the fact that for genomic prediction to actually work really well for your industry or for your population is that you need to be related to the training set. So you actually need to be able to have animals that are tested that are actually related to an animal that has been ramguard tested. So simply going into a completely naive flock in Southland somewhere and doing a whole lot of testing is going to do you no good. Your accuracies are going to come out very poor because you have no relationship to those animals that have been ramguard tested. So you actually need to be doing a combination of actually buying in animals that have actually been tested and selected, and then after a period of time you will be able to start on a selection process using genomics to identify out some of the really susceptible animals, but then having to continue advancing up that scale using the traditional approach. So it's not a one-hit wonder to solving, but it is something that I think that all New Zealand sheep breeders actually need to be starting now for the future, because if you're not currently affected or not currently supplying to people that are affected, I don't think that will be the case in 10 to 15 years' time. So this is meant to be interactive. For some of you in the room, I know that this is something that you've lived and breathed for a long time, but I also know that there's a lot of outstanding questions for you as to how this all works. Others in the room, not much exposure to facial eczema and maybe wanting to think about starting on the journey and path. So I'd like everyone to quickly jot down a question.
All the ones that want to. If
Yeah.
you've got a question, put something on it.
And if there are any questions you'd like discussed in a public forum.
So any questions?
Probably got time for maybe one or two.
Yep. Yep. Yes. Oh, we've got one at the back first, sorry.
Currently there isn't a marker for the Coopworth breed.
Yes.
Currently there isn't a DNA marker for the Coopworth.
Mm-hmm.
So we need to do more genotyping.
Yes.
So how far away is that likely to be?
So something that I didn't mention is that, like we're sitting there with the Perindales, that we're sitting at only about 300 genotype to this point. They've actually developed a breed initiative strategy and we're testing over 300 animals a year. We are actually, Beef and Lamb Genetics are actually investing in genotyping specifically for facial eczema. We've waited to the next version of the SNP chip, a 15K version, comes out this coming year, but so within this 15-16 financial year we're looking to genotype about another 2,500 animals using this 15K, of which all of the current Coopworths that are being tested will be included, but there is a need with the Perindale and the Coopworth to actually increase the diversity and the number of breeders that are actually doing the testing so that it is actually an across-breed accurate approach.
For industry good, we actually need to develop a cheaper test to test more animals, basically, don't we?
Yep.
And that's something that needs to happen straight away, basically,
Because at the moment the cost is anywhere, if you can test in Southland and you can do ram lambs, you can test it when they're smaller and it's $100 and something to test, but if you have to wait until the spring when there's no natural challenge around, you're talking $200 to $300 an animal. So it's a very expensive phenotype to actually make. Yes?
Given the fact that you've mentioned that it's quite hereditable, How far away would we be from perhaps, when you're talking about foot scores and foot rot cold tolerance, how far away would you like to be from?
So there is actually a poster from Shannon and Suzanne from the genomics team that we do have some ideas of some regions that may be associated with it, but we want to do some validation of those in the coming year when we do these 2,500. We've actually put some of the SNPs from the big 50k version of that on this little mini 15k, and so we're going to look at doing some validation this coming year. So fingers crossed that we might get something, but if Simfua was here, the QTLs that have come and gone with facial eczema have continued to haunt us. So we'll have to keep our fingers crossed that this time next year we'll be presenting something.
Because they have those for some of these recessive genes
Yeah.
and all that kind of thing.
Yep.
I'm sure if they tried hard, I'm sure we could get there.
Yep, we're going to try. We're trying this year.
Okay, thank you.
Just to precaution people that are going to use 5k or 50k to say whether the sheep are tolerant or not. We did that first time last year, and when we did this 0.6 thing, we had some that they said we shouldn't have tested passed, and some they said that would pass, didn't pass.
Yep.
So if we'd gone on purely 5k to keep our soil replacement stud rams, we would have gone backwards last year. So I'd just like to mention anyone that's going to use 5k or 50k to pick out their eczema tolerant rams, be very cautious.